Today we're talking about selective mutism.
Sponsored by Geldards, leading experts in special educational needs and disability law.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to have back with me today Libby Hill, who's an award-winning speech and language therapist. Today we're going to be covering selective mutism, which is very misunderstood, I think is wise to say. So I thought actually we'll get a good flavour for selective mutism and make sure that everybody has a good basic understanding because we know that that is particularly lacking at the moment. So hi Libby, thank you very much
Chrissa.
for coming in again.
My pleasure.
So selective mutism, it's a topic that raises a lot of conversation, strangely enough.
Yeah.
But we hear so many awful things from certain clinicians who say things like, they're choosing not to speak, wouldn't speak for me, that sort of thing. And we find that a lot of children are then discharged from services because they're deemed to be awkward or, whatever it may be, but it's never a particularly positive experience. So could you give us a little bit of a flavour for what selective mutism is, please?
Well, selective mutism, in a nutshell, is an inability to speak in certain situations when you can talk fully and freely elsewhere. So it's in the diagnostic manuals, so it's not even one that we should be arguing about because it's clear in the DSM-5, ICD-11, it's clear what selective mutism is. The difficulty in Britain, and I believe is the same in other places, is that it's whose responsibility is it? So it falls between services. So on some services, it's speech and language therapy. So they will have experts in their team who can help. They can diagnose, they can do everything. In other areas, it's CAM's remit and CAM's responsibility. There are other areas where sometimes the Ed Psychs might take that on.
Oh, okay.
But there are other areas where nobody takes it on. And this is where we get the difficulty.
Yeah.
So if we were in Northampton, there's a clear pathway of what happens if a parent is reporting that their child isn't speaking at school.
Okay.
Other areas, they'll go to the GP, that's usually the first port of call, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the GP will refer to speech and language therapy, and they say, well, as they're refusing to talk, and then they're discharged. So they've tried and failed. It's just dreadful. Mostly CAMS will say that it isn't a bad enough difficulty, but in actual fact, it is a manifestation of anxiety.
Yeah.
So usually a social anxiety. And there are some people who would like us to see it as a phobia of talking and treat it as a phobia of talking. And that works okay really for the younger ones. So if they had a phobia of spiders, you wouldn't force them to interact with spiders. So why would you, if they had a phobia of talking, try and force them to speak? We really need so much better understanding. It upsets me and infuriates me in equal measures. If we can get hold of a 4-year-old who isn't talking, then we can make it so that they are okay by the time they start school.
Brilliant.
We can get a really good transition, we can sort it. So if I have a 14-year-old come to me with selective mutism, that's a completely different bag, and it's so much harder because they have had years of being the boy or girl who doesn't talk, and they almost take that on as their identity. So rather than a child with selective mutism, they are the selectively mute child or young person. And I've done a lot of work with teenagers, so it's it's a completely bespoke package for teenagers, but it can have some really good success because they tend to be very motivated. So they've got to 16 and realise the rites of passage of a teenager are gone unless you can talk. Now that's awful, but how would you do driving lessons because you've got to talk to the instructor? How would you have your Saturday job to pay for the driving lessons? Applying for college when there's going to be an interview, all those things. So I find that they're highly motivated, so you can really do an eclectic approach for their particular need. But it's not that rare. So epidemiologically it is. So the stats are 1 in 150 children will have selective mutism at some time.
Yeah.
Drops down to adults, I think it's 1 in 500. But actually, if we add in the low profile selective mutism, it probably is more like 1 in 125. Well, the official stats for autism are 1 in 100,
Yeah.
if you look at the official stats.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So actually, this is a significant difficulty.
Absolutely.
And it needs to be addressed. There are two different styles of selective mutism. So we'll have the high profile that everybody would understand. They just don't talk at school.
Yeah.
But then there's others who will talk when absolutely necessary, because the fear of not pleasing the adult outweighs the fear of talking. So we call that low profile.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that are really hard to pick up because they answer the register.
Yeah.
Or they might even put their hand up and answer a question, particularly in maths where there's no chance of them getting it wrong.
Yeah.
But they can't talk fully and freely. They can't offer opinions or work as part of a group. So it's still selective mutism, but we would call that low profile.
Okay, and is there like a fear in there as well? You've just mentioned now about getting it right or wrong.
Yes.
Is there like that sort of almost like a pathological fear of getting it wrong, whatever they're about to say?
Yes, but it might not be a fear that they are aware of.
Okay.
So with the younger ones, sometimes you can see the fear on their face, but teenagers and adults with selective mutism will say, it's wrong to say fear.
Okay.
I'm not afraid of the actual talking, it's just that I can't.
Okay.
But that goes back to that cognitive choice versus neural response.
I see. Yeah.
So if we look at Stephen Porges, who did the polyvagal theory, he will say you might have the cognitive desire to do something, but your neural response means you can't. And that neural response, again, is to a trauma response. So fight, flight, freeze with a high profile, and with a low profile, that fourth, lesser known one, fawn. But it's still a trauma response.
And it's not actually selective. They're not electing to do this.
No.
And it's something that I know a lot of parents and those who are affected by selective mutism are quite outward about, in the fact that, is it the wrong title to be using?
Yes, it's better than the one before. When I first qualified, it was elective mutism.
Okay.
But it still sounds as if there's a choice in there,
Yes,
doesn't it?
yeah, absolutely.
So I don't think it'll happen for a while, but there is a lobby to say, could we call it situational anxiety disorder or situation communication disorder,
Okay.
so that you get the situation in there.
Yes.
Because it's important that people realise that it's not just non-verbal.
Yeah.
So I do get the occasional child and they say he's got selective mutism, but actually he might be autistic and non-verbal.
Yes.
So he's not talking anywhere fully and freely. So there is that difference.
And selective mutism, can it have a co-occurring presentation such as autism or anything else, really?
It can, yes. I mean, we knew previously that you could have autism and selective mutism, and you did need to identify the two.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how can you do things that would help both of
Yes.
them? But officially we weren't allowed to say that. We did sort of get shot down when we said that before. But since July 2018 with the ICD-11, there's sufficient ambiguity in there now to be able to have a dual diagnosis.
Brilliant.
But it is important to notice that, because there are some overlaps with autism, and if you've got selective mutism, it's quite hard to test for autism.
Yes,
There was it was a study, but it's not a particularly validated study. It was a study for interest done by Carol Pickford on the Smira Facebook page, and basically Care Pickford Carol, that's what she's called. She had asked how many of you with a diagnosis of selective mutism has also got a diagnosis of autism, and there was around 30%.
Oh, interesting.
So that it's not everybody with autism has selective mutism, and certainly not everybody with selective mutism has autism. But if you do have selective mutism, there will be some common things. So you will have that social anxiety, and maybe your social communication is affected by that. So your social thinking can be slightly impaired on that as well. Definitely needs renaming, so we could explain it better. With autism and selective mutism, I like the Autistica definition of ASD, where it talks about it as the ice cream sundae, so that your autism doesn't look the same at different ages. And if you saw the selective mutism as perhaps a flake in your ice cream sundae, it's not there forever, because selective mutism isn't there forever. You might need help to get over it, but it isn't there forever.
And I think that's what's important, is so many people almost blame a diagnosis and therefore then don't go ahead and meet needs because they make excuses for that particular child, rather than looking at the speech and language needs, addressing them.
Oh, yes, big time.
And I think that's something that a lot of parents and professionals that we work with become quite fed up with. I don't think I could put it any prettier than that. They're fed up with it, that we look at a child and we see their anxiety and then just say, ignore that, it's just anxiety. Or ignore that, they're just autistic. Or ignore that, they have selective mutism. Rather than actually looking at the whys and digging beneath all of that.
Yes, because the best thing that we can do for children or young people with selective mutism is to get the environment right. Because the selective mutism is telling us that they don't feel safe. So we need to make the environment one where they do feel safe. So we need to get the environment right. We need to train the staff, because there's lots of ways of making communication pressure. So it could be cajoling. Oh, come on, I really like you. Can you? Or it could be, right, if you're not going to speak, I'm not going to do that. There's a whole range in between, but it's still pressure to communicate, and that's what we need to get rid of.
Definitely.
So that even a difference in questioning, so what's your favourite colour, is pressure. But if I said, I wonder what your favourite colour is, you're more likely to be able to answer.
Yes.
Because it's less pressure.
Of course. So it is very much anxiety based.
Yes.
So we need to be looking at that anxiety in order for then the symptoms of the anxiety to improve, I guess.
Exactly, yes. And what can we do to assist the child? So not necessarily what have they got to do to get over it.
No, absolutely,
What can we do to make them feel more at ease so they're more likely to be able to talk?
Because we've got to meet them where they are.
Yes.
Haven't we?
Yeah, like with most things, really.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I hope you found that really useful. We've got some workshops coming up on selective mutism and we would love to see you there. We encourage parents and professionals to come along. And if both can come for one child, then even better. It means we're all on the same page. Libby and her team will be leading those workshops, so please do come along. And thank you again, Libby. It's been wonderful again. Thank you.